This is going to be 5.2 Jefferson as president. We're going to start with a quote from Jefferson himself, who says, "That government is best which governs least." Probably he said that. This is something that's attributed to him, although we're not 100% sure. But it does summarize his feelings on big government in a big way, which is that he believed that a federal government should be as small as possible. Although we're going to see he comes into conflict with his own feelings on this sometimes. Our objectives. We're going to understand why some saw Jefferson's election as the Democratic Republican Revolution of 1800. We're going to explain the impact of John Marshall's time as Chief Justice. We're going to identify the importance of the Louisiana Purchase and analyze Jefferson's foreign policies while President of the United States. So let's start with a new direction for the American government. So, Democratic Republicans, people like Thomas Jefferson, were not just calling it a win in 1800. They said that it was a return to the ideas of the American Revolution and the ideals of the American Revolution, what it should have been. They were reforming the government after it had been muddled by Washington and Adams and large federalism. They set out to change the way things were done, too. So they are moving to a more small state government way and reducing the power of the federal government. So Federalists had copied a lot of the style of the British monarchy, and Jefferson wanted to reform it. In his mind, Jefferson said that America should be a nation of farmers from sea to shining sea. We should be nothing but small farmers who are self sufficient, and that is the way that we should be. So this is our third president, Thomas Jefferson, president from 1801 to '09 from Virginia, where he was a planter and inventor, delegate to the Continental Congress. He was our ambassador to France, governor of Virginia during the war, secretary of state, and vice president. He had quite the laundry list of attributes. And he also popularized ice cream in North America, for which I thank him very much. So Jefferson wanted to cut the size of the government. He wanted to cut taxes, and he very quickly got rid of the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. Also, unlike Hamilton, who was not dead yet, but on his way out, Jefferson did not want to use the national debt in order to create more international trade and business. He just wanted to get rid of the debt. He also made big cuts to our Army and our Navy. We're going to see that's an issue later on. And he also cut the amount of people working for the government in Washington, what we call the bureaucracy, the people working in the departments. He felt that there should be, again, the smallest government possible. So during this time, he got a big boost from foreign trade, especially with France. And he saw a lot of people moving west, especially with what he's going to do with the Louisiana territories. Now, government was not the only thing he changed. He did not act like a regal president. He did not like, for instance, the fancy dress up balls that Washington and Adams had put on. He was more simple in his attire, more simple in his social events. He wanted to appear presentable but also accessible. Now, Jefferson was very personally wealthy, at least for the time being. He did dress very simply in the common style of the time, including known to have been answering doors in his PJs at some points. He also sat people not by social standing, but just together at parties. So here's a picture of Thomas Jefferson, or maybe I could be wrong, but anyway, here is actually, this is Jefferson in France on the left and Jefferson in the White House on the right. You'll notice that at times he did dress very regally. However, when he got to the White House, he wanted to make an impression and set a statement. Now, let's look at John Marshall. This is going to be important. You're going to want to check out Judicial Review, so make sure you're paying attention to this part. So, when Jefferson became president in 1801, the new Chief Justice had just taken his seat. John Marshall had just become the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Marshall was a Federalist, one of the few Federalists left in the federal government. And he stayed on the court for 35 years, and he said a lot of ideas about the power of the Supreme Court, which is not explicitly stated very well in the Constitution itself. The Constitution more or less says we should have a Supreme Court. It was Marshall who said what they would do. So here's John Marshall, 1755 to 1835, from Virginia, where he was a congressman for a while and Secretary of State. He also was a soldier during the Revolution. He was actually related to Thomas Jefferson through marriage. They both married people from the same families, and he ended up serving 35 years on the court. Now, John Marshall decided, basically as Chief Justice, that the Supreme Court, the job of the Supreme Court was to decide whether or not laws passed by Congress or executive orders passed by the president were constitutional. So, the Supreme Court deciding the constitutionality of laws is known as judicial review, and it's not in the Constitution, although it was sort of an accepted part of the Constitution, even though it was not explicitly stated. But the idea that Marshall created this is a precedent, much like we saw with Washington. John Marshall's judicial review is a precedent that we still use today. Now, Marshall also had a very broad reading of the Constitution, as he was a loose constructionist, and this impacted the cases that went before him as Chief Justice, and the fact that he was a Federalist. So the case that established judicial review, which is really hard to say, is Marbury versus Madison. So more or less, on the last few nights of his presidency, John Adams appointed a bunch of federal judges and a bunch of other things like justices of the peace and things like that, including a guy named William Marbury. However, they were signed, but they were not delivered to the Secretary of State. And so the new Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to accept these as fully written, and he refused to allow Marbury to take his position. Marbury sued him, and in the end, Marshall sided with Madison almost on a technicality, basically saying that this case was filed at the wrong level, more or less. Now, the big takeaway of this is that Marshall had sided with the Democratic Republicans, basically so no one could say that he was being partisan when he created judicial review. However, that is more or less the last time that he is going to side ever with Democratic Republicans. However, also in doing this, he gave himself and the Supreme Court this huge power of judicial review, saying that they had the power to decide constitutionality. Now, Democratic Republicans believe that states should get to decide what's constitutional, but Marshall said no. In fact, in a later decision, he said that the Supreme Court has the right to decide whether state laws are constitutional as well. So that is really, 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 really important. Now, after establishing this judicial review, Marshall never again ruled against the federal government. He was a Federalist through and through. He believed in large government above all else. All of his other rulings were usually against the states or rulings that strengthened the power of the federal government. He also believed that there were gray areas and loopholes and implied powers in the constitutions where the Constitution didn't say you could do it, but it also didn't say you couldn't do it, so that's a loophole, I guess. Now, let's also look at Jefferson heading west a little bit. So Jefferson thought that owning a farm, being a yeoman farmer again, was the best way to be. It was the best symbol of American citizenship. It was what Americans should be. We were a land of farmers in Jefferson's mind. The problem is that if we wanted this to be true, we needed a lot more land. We needed to grow our country. And so America's population was getting huge during this time. We needed to expand the size of America. And he did this through the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson was looking to start small. He was looking to purchase the city of New Orleans from the French government being led by Napoleon. And Napoleon was willing to sell because France had been weakened by a revolution in Haiti, and also they were fighting a war with Great Britain at the time. Napoleon wanted money, cash money on the table. However, he didn't offer New Orleans. He offered all of the Louisiana Territory. And with this Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson accepted, Jefferson doubled the size of our country. He got 828,000 miles of real estate for only $15 million, which is a great price. So here's our former next-door neighbor, Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" And here's the size of the Louisiana Territory. It's big. It's very big. Now, the only person who wasn't fully happy with this Louisiana Purchase that Jefferson made was Jefferson. Because in order to get this, he had to make a quick deal, and he had not gone to Congress to do it. So he had gone beyond the powers of the president in the Constitution, and he felt really unnerved about the fact that he'd gone around the Constitution, basically. He'd argued for a minimal federal government, but he had used very broad federal powers to make this deal. In the end, he basically said, it's fine. It's, I'm not comfortable, but I really want that land. Now, in 1804, Jefferson sent two explorers and about 50 other guys, Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery, to explore this new territory, along with a woman named Sacagawea. Sacagawea was also invaluable on this trip. She was married to one of their people. The Lewis and Clark expedition, sometimes known as the Corps of Discovery, made a lot of important discoveries and sort of did a trek through this new land that we bought. In fact, they went beyond it and hit the west coast in Oregon. So here are Lewis and Clark and their dog Seaman in St. Charles, Missouri, if any of you have seen that statue. And here is Sacagawea, 1788 to 1812, born in Idaho, or what became Idaho. She was married to the French trapper Toussaint Charbonneau at about 13 years old after being bought by Charbonneau. She worked as a translator and a guide for Lewis and Clark, even though she had just given birth. And some urban legends say that she didn't die early on in her life, but instead lived to be almost 100. Now, here is the path of Lewis and Clark, which, as you can see, went all the way to Oregon. They went beyond the Louisiana Territory. They explored a good long way, perhaps thinking that eventually this land might be ours anyway. Now, let's look at foreign difficulties with Jefferson. So, the Louisiana Purchase was a big win for Jefferson, but he did have problems with other countries and with sort of figuring out how to stabilize the American economy. So, for instance, we had trouble with Africa, of all places. The Barbary States, which were several North African Muslim caliphates, were pirates, more or less. They would hijack American ships, hold the boats and the sailors hostage, and the Adams administration had been paying money to the Barbary States, basically bribing them not to take our boats anymore. Jefferson said he was going to do the same thing, but then they increased the price. And so instead, he sent the very small American Navy to North Africa, where we won the Barbary War of 1805, but it was a close thing. And Jefferson had to sort of rethink what he had done, which he had lowered the size of the Army and Navy, and then had to use the Army and the Navy and call for a larger Army and Navy. So here are the places of the Barbary Coast: Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli. And by the way, this guy in front stabbing the other guy is Stephen Decatur, hero of the Tripolitan Wars, aka the Barbary Wars. He was seen as a possible presidential nominee before he died in a duel. Sound familiar? Now, Britain and France became at war during this time, and America was sort of making money by selling goods to the French. But the British were very upset that American merchants were trading with the French, believing that they should only trade with the British. We had been closer to Britain during the Adams years. And this led to Great Britain capturing American ships and stealing American sailors off of them. So this idea of forcing American sailors to join the British Navy is called impressment. And this is what it looked like. By 1812, over 6,000 American troops had been impressed, and America was not very impressed with this, if you follow my... Get it? Anyway, Democratic Republicans were very angered by this because, honestly, they were not huge fans of England in the first place. Unfortunately, Jefferson had cut the size of our Navy, and that meant that it was very difficult for our Navy to be able to stop them. Instead, Jefferson tried to use economics to stop them. He used an embargo against the British in 1807, where he suspended trade with the British and ordered American ships to stay in port. And he thought that this would, eventually the British would starve without American goods and would come crawling back. Instead, they just headed to Egypt and headed to India instead. And this embargo mostly ended up hurting Americans. He got rid of it before he left office in 1809. Now, after 8 years in office, Jefferson was replaced by Madison, who we will see in the next section about the War of 1812.